God in Darkness, Book 1, Truthseeker, written by Stephen Eric Johnson, read to you by Matthias Justin Johnson. Chapter 6, Blood-Stained Night on the Docks. The night was warm and moist, a fat red moon hanging low on the horizon, a silent testament to the early hour. Dawn would be coming soon. Sheriff Maxwell Malone frowned as he ducked under the yellow tape surrounding the battered warehouse on the edge of the dock district, though he barely restrained his internal grumbling over the recent spike in his workload. He noted the gaping hole punched through the massive steel loading doors at the front of the building before using the untouched side entrance to gain access to the crime scene. The officer at the front who'd briefed him on the mess inside stayed where he was, his young face pale, obviously not wanting to go back into the charnel environment of the warehouse. Malone didn't blame him, as a quick glance around revealed a whole bunch of chalk outlines all over the place, most of them accompanied by substantial dark stains on the stark gray concrete floor, and several of them indicating that the stiff who was being represented hadn't been in one piece. What the place must have been like before the bodies were toted out, the graying sheriff didn't really want to think about. "Hey, Max!" called a familiar voice, followed by the appearance of its owner only moments later as she looked up from around a stairway leading up to the warehouse's main office. "Get a load of this mess!" Malone's eyes moved to Sergeant Maria Carmen Sanchez. He smiled at her, though, as usual, the smile never quite made it to his eyes. They'd dated a few years back, and it had ended on a sour, inconclusive note. It was just like everybody had told him from the start. Don't date Mexibloods. They always start out as sweet as syrup, but they end as harsh as cactus prickles. Business was business, though, and Malone didn't shirk his job, no matter how much he might not like some of the people he had to work with. "What's up, Sanchez?" asked the barrel-bodied cop as he walked toward the sergeant standing near the middle of the huge warehouse, frowning a little when he noticed that she was smiling at him, and unlike him, the smile really was reaching into the soft creases around her eyes. He ignored this, and looked down at the chalk outline at the woman's feet and the messy, drying splatter of red-brown that accompanied it. "What's this guy's story?" "Poor guy took a nosedive from up there," said Sanchez, pointing up the stairs toward a windowed office almost 30 feet off the floor of the warehouse. The window to said office was smashed, the glass littering the floor all around where the body had lain before it had been carted off. "He was going pretty fast when he went through the window. Least, that's what the paramedics said, and I believe 'em. It'd take a lot more than just 20 feet to do what this guy did when he went splat. Nobody's moved anything up there. We knew you'd want to see the evidence there before it got collected." Malone grunted and nodded, then started up the stairs, careful to avoid the dark puddles that were still slick with dead wetness as Sanchez followed behind. He avoided looking at Sanchez as much as possible, knowing that she might get ideas if he made too much eye contact. Of course, she was probably getting ideas anyway, but at least he could try and keep them to a minimum. It was all he could do to keep from rolling his eyes. Only a Mexiblud would get amorous ideas in the middle of a murder scene. "Looks like Caduce's cargo was just a front," said Sanchez as they climbed the stairs. "Some of the boxes they had around here were loaded with enough coke to kill a herd of elephants. It's gonna take a little ironing out before we go to court, but we're here legally enough, and the stuff wasn't concealed or anything. Somebody dumped it all over the floor, and anybody that might have turned us away was too dead to stop us from coming in." "I heard at the front that we got a call from a concerned neighbor on this place," said Malone as he stepped through the empty doorway to the office, the door lying on the warehouse floor not far from the chalk outline below, something having wrenched it from its hinges and tossed it almost casually aside. "Something about gunshots and screams and stuff." Lucky break for us, this is a murder scene, said Sanchez with a smirk, the deaths surrounding her not troubling her in the slightest. It'll make a whole lot easier to push through the evidence of drug smuggling. Unless somebody has Franz, muttered Malone under his breath, taking a quick look around the office. Big city crooks trying to move in on my town must have all sorts of money to spread around in the right places. We're just lucky this operation was dealing with old-fashioned coke and not one of the tailored poisons. Don't know what we'd do against something like Blitz or Red Mist. The opposition gets as nasty as the stuff being moved. As it stands, all we have to handle is some black market dealing. His first look around the office ended, letting him memorize the basic layout for later consideration. Malone blinked and took another long look. In the office was a large oak desk facing the door, so big it dominated the rest of the room, a set of file cabinets by the wide shattered window, and a very large safe, almost big enough for a man of Malone's size to walk inside, against the far wall behind the desk. The massive steel door to the safe had been ripped off as casually as the door to the office had been, and stood propped against the wall. In the safe were several neat stacks of money, for bribes, a few plastic bags filled with white powder, samples of the product, a few assorted firearms, for emergencies, and an open metal box filled with manila folders neatly labeled with names, for blackmail. Malone walked over and picked up one of the folders at random, then grunted as he discovered that it was empty. Looks like somebody got what he wanted, said Sanchez with a shrug. Not a one of those files has a thing in it. All the information these guys had has been cleaned out. No way to find out who they were working for or anything. Looks like somebody wanted us to know what he wanted, said Malone, tossing the empty folder back into the safe with the others. That money doesn't look like it's been touched, and there's got to be at least a kilo of coke in this safe. Whatever was in these files must have been pretty important to whoever lifted it. Well, at least we've got something to show for our troubles, said Sanchez with a grin. I mean, this is the biggest bust we've ever made in this place. Best thing for our careers we're probably ever gonna see way out here in the burbs, too. Nothing goes down in this town, Max. Gets pretty dull after a while. You know I'm a city girl at heart. My great-granddad was in the NYPD before the city got wasted during the 3-Day War. My granddad worked for the Border Patrol keeping Texans on their side of the line during the territorial split, and my dad took a bullet in the line of duty in the mutant riots. I grew up with action, and police blood runs as thick as lead in my veins. Malone couldn't restrain himself from rolling his eyes as he listened to Sanchez's melodramatics. They were just one of the many reasons he'd never really hit it off with her. Quickly, he picked up another folder, this time from the bottom of the stack, to keep her from noticing his sour expression. Dull is a good thing, Sanchez, he said simply, blinking in surprise as he found a single piece of paper left in the slender folder. I've done the big city action thing, and I'm not going back. Not ever. He scanned the words before him, then tucked it back into the folder. Best you enjoy the boredom while you can, though. I get the feeling that things will get more interesting after this, once the city gangs learn they can make inroads in this town. Then it's going to be nothing but work, work, work. Putting the folder he'd just closed under his arm, Sheriff Malone turned and walked out of the office, letting Sanchez trail along behind him for as long as she cared to do so. He sighed deeply, feeling the weight of his age heavy upon his shoulders, ignoring the buzzing of blood-hungry flies and the bustle of the ambulance workers as they cleaned up the last of the mess for transport to the morgue. Then, just before stepping back out into the clear night air, Malone paused to look at the hole torn in the front of the building. He frowned deeply, his eyes following the lines of the torn metal. This isn't the entry point, he said at long last. This is an exit. As Sanchez watched with a puzzled look on her pretty face, Malone stepped in close to the ruptured loading doors, squinting in the dim light of the flashing red and blue of the nearby police cars. After some close scrutiny, the bulky sheriff walked away for a few minutes to get a pair of plastic gloves from a box resting on the trunk of one of the squad cars, then quickly returned. Reaching around the curl of one jagged edge, he carefully extracted a small black tuft of what appeared to be animal fur. "Getting evidence, Baggy," said Malone to Sanchez, waiting until she came back with the asked-for item, then tucking the black tuft safely into the plastic. "I want this analyzed. I also want somebody to check out the roof of the warehouse. I think that's where our perps came in." "Some dog was shedding, and you want to know what breed it is?" asked Sanchez incredulously. "You're the boss, Max, but sometimes I think you've got nickels where there's supposed to be gray stuff." Despite her complaint, however, Sanchez did as she was told, heading off to get the bit of evidence Malone had found filed away. Meanwhile, Malone walked to his marked sheriff's car, the manila folder still tucked under his arm. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, feeling a headache coming on. "I moved to the burbs to get away from all this stuff," the sheriff said to nobody in particular as he slid behind the wheel. "And all it does is follow me home." And then, just before the sheriff was about to slam his car door, he heard something. A voice. The voice was so soft that Sheriff Maxwell Malone almost missed it. But Malone's senses were quite keen despite his graying hairs, and his reflexes were honed from long years spent on his side of the thin blue line. Turning, he swept his eyes over the scene, across the tall dead grass that lined the yard surrounding the warehouse. He strained his ears, climbing out of the car and walking to the corner of the big building. "Help me." Malone was certain of what he'd heard now, and began to hustle forward, drawing the looks of some of his officers as they finished their part in the evidence collection and were walking back to their cars. The sheriff was known for not liking to run when he could avoid it, and so they all knew that when he hurried, something important was happening. Rounding the corner of the building at a full run, Sheriff Malone came to a dead stop. Lying on the beach near the riverbank, almost completely obscured from sight in the tall grass and the darkness of the night, was a lone figure, face thrust down in the wet sand. After a few seconds had passed, the dark figure lifted his head again, spat out some of the grit that had stuck in his teeth, then looked around in the darkness as he drew in a few gasping breaths, his wide eyes obviously seeing nothing, his mouth opening to call for help once more. Malone was there before he was able to say another word, ready to react in a heartbeat in a case of trouble. The sheriff noted with some mild surprise that the person was a black man, his teeth and eyes the most visible parts of his face. He'd only seen a handful of that race in all his years, and they'd always been criminals when he had run into them. Then he shoved that detail aside. It didn't really have anything to do with his job at present. Later, it'd probably be important, but right now he just needed to keep the suspect alive, maybe get some information out of him while he was still dazed, stuff that'd help him understand what took place that night on the docks. "What happened?" asked Malone as he closed on the black-skinned fellow, obviously a criminal type, judging from the packed collar around his neck, denoting which gang he'd pledged his life to serving, its bright colors clearly visible thanks to a big rent on the back of his black shirt. "You still able to talk?" The hoodlum looked sharply up at the sheriff with a face that was so young it startled Malone for a moment. This kid couldn't have been much older than his own daughter, Malone realized with a slight lurch, and the thought sickened him slightly. The youth then breathed a deep sigh of relief, his whole body seeming to give out. "It's you," said the young black man with obvious relief. "Police, not that thing. Thank the gods." This last was delivered with a deep and frankly frightening level of feeling. But before Malone could ask any more questions, the young hood was face down in the sand again, his consciousness utterly fled, and he was unable to respond to any more entreaties for information. "Get a stretcher over here," Malone bawled out, gently turning the young man's face to the side. He noted with a quick visual rundown that the young man didn't appear to be injured, just emotionally exhausted from the events of the night. When the boy found out that he was safe, that being a strictly relative term, of course, considering what was likely to happen to him now, he had simply fallen asleep, the strain of whatever he'd endured that night finally making his whole body just give in to its need for rest to escape from the trauma of seeing so much killing. Malone had been in the mutant riots himself, same as Sanchez's father, protecting what was left of civilization from the fury of the monsters in the wastelands across the border, and he clearly remembered the stark, aching weariness that could settle into your bones right after the adrenaline wore off. After seeing the black boy packed into the back of an ambulance, the sheriff heaved a long, cleansing breath, held it there for a few minutes, and then let it out nice and slow. One of the paramedics had agreed with the sheriff, saying that the kid was healthy enough, no visible injuries, and so Malone had instructed the driver of the ambulance to drop the kid off at the station for interrogation. "Poor kid," said the older man, shaking his head as he finally slid back into his cruiser. "I wish I hadn't seen him. Then I wouldn't have to prosecute him for being black." Jimmy Ham knew that cops were bad trouble normally, but they could be handled as long as you were careful and had a few friends to back you up. It was a lot harder to do in the city because of how tight everything was kept by the city police, and especially their chief, Captain Harver. Stories about that mad mother's son had been what Jimmy's mama used to scare him into being good, for fear that Captain Harver would get him. As he'd gotten older, of course, those stories took on a much more sinister light, since only a few of the more outlandish details were actually made up. All the rest, as even a teenager like him could figure out pretty quick, were all too real. Cops outside the city, though, they weren't nothin'. Most of them didn't really care much if you were black, and tended not to bother you as long as you weren't obviously up to something, which was just as well since being black was, technically at least, a crime punishable by death. As it was, Jimmy expected to spend the night in a cold cell and be out before morning, or tomorrow night at the latest. How that would happen, he didn't really know, but whether by bribery or brute force, he was going to be saved, and that meant that where he was might be the safest place on Earth right about then. Certainly a lot safer than where he'd just been. Sitting across from Jimmy in the small interrogation room was the old sheriff. Paunchy, balding, his formerly red hair now looking almost blonde from the fading it had gone through with the passing of years. He didn't look threatening to the young man, and Jimmy was pretty sure that, however he got out of here, it wouldn't be too hard with a guy like Sheriff Malone in charge. Sure, he knew not to underestimate cops, no matter what they looked like, but something about the sheriff told Jimmy that the guy really didn't want to do anything bad to the kid. While it didn't make Jimmy trust the sheriff by any stretch of imagination, it did make him more willing to cooperate than he might have been otherwise. What Sheriff Malone wanted to talk about was what happened that night. It all flashed before Jimmy's window of memory, and he shuddered as he sorted out the chaos, meticulously making sense of the whirlwind of death that he'd somehow been allowed to survive. The night had started a lot like most nights over the last 2 weeks, just picking up heavy boxes and handing them to the next guy. Jimmy didn't know what was in the boxes, and he didn't really want to know. He'd gotten the job from his big brother, the same big brother he expected would spring him come the daylight, and the same big brother who'd given him the packed colors, as a way of proving he was worthy to hang with the other Bloods hauling boxes or standing guard with their guns and other weapons at the ready, maybe 20 or so of them in total, though Jimmy never saw all of them at once, and the confines of the warehouse were too stacked with boxes and loading equipment and trucks for him to see much. He didn't even get more than a glimpse of the face of the man in charge, watching through the big picture window of his elevated office, sitting pretty while everyone else sweated bullets in the humid night air by the river. Not that Jimmy felt to complain too much, though. Money was money, after all, and if you had to tell a few lies just for the chance to earn the stuff that could mean the difference between life and death, then you told a few lies. Jimmy was just glad they were lies of omission, letting the others assume what they wanted about him based on his colors and the say-so of his big brother. He was also glad he didn't have to talk personally with the big boss, because every time that man's eyes passed over him through that high window, Jimmy got the feeling somebody was walking over his grave. Whoever that man was, he was nobody to be messed with. That much Jimmy knew, and that was all he wanted to know. Then it had all started, and things got a bit hazy for Jimmy, turning into a panicked blur of events. They'd only got about half of the boxes off the back of the truck that had unloaded from the nearby river barge, and everybody was heavily into the rhythm of the work, losing themselves in the assembly line-like motions of handing box after box along the line, as fast as they could without dropping any. Even the guards with their weapons at the ready seemed to be falling under the spell of the work and the lateness of the hour, everything just going so routine, just like it had the last few nights. The only person who seemed as sharp-eyed as before was the boss, but he never left his office. Everybody was so caught up in the work, in fact, that nobody reacted for several long, fatal seconds when the sound of shattering glass came from up above. The skylight, Jimmy remembered, thinking in that vague, half-dreaming way that comes with the stupor of repetitive physical labor, his mind gradually coming back online as he realized that something was wrong. "Close the door!" yelled the boss from the doorway to his office, a large-caliber pistol flashing in his hands, the first of them all to react, his precision of movement cold and deadly as he turned the pistol down onto the floor of the warehouse, following something that was moving between the high stacks of boxes. A moment later, the boss's chief lieutenant turned and hit the switch that brought down the heavy metal door at the front of the warehouse, a door that had been specially reinforced to repel bullets and, it was rumored by Jimmy's fellow workers, explosives. The truck had been driven inside the warehouse before anyone had started to unload it, and that meant once the doors came down, everybody who'd been brought on shift to work that night was now inside the warehouse, ready to turn from loading crew to cold-blooded killers. Jimmy looked around with wide eyes as the gangsters produced weapons of all sorts, pistols and knives and shotguns and clubs, from their clothes, from the bags they'd brought with them, and from the interior of the truck itself. The ones who'd been on guard still toted their machine guns of various sizes, and one of them, who'd set up shop on the top of the truck, even had a huge rifle that was longer than he was tall, and the man was not short by any stretch, the massive barrel braced inside a small clamp that latched to the top of the truck itself. Of them all, only Jimmy was unarmed, save for a switchblade he kept in his pocket for emergencies. He brought the weapon out slowly, hoping that nobody would notice, in the midst of all that firepower, what he'd brought to the show. "It's coming!" yelled the boss once more, lowering the wrist of the hand holding the pistol to rest on his other forearm, creating a makeshift platform for him to use while he aimed carefully at the something that was moving, swift as shadows, through the rows of boxes, stacked high like the walls and pillars of a tomb. "Stick together and get ready!" Jimmy heard the clicks of firearms all around him as the gangsters and cold-blooded killers chambered their rounds, fingers itching on their triggers. The tall, thin man on top of the truck giggled slightly as he adjusted his dark, round glasses with one hand, the other gripping the trigger, before he started to move that hand from his glasses back to the side of the long, thick-barreled rifle, to stabilize it and help him aim at his target. That hand never touched the rifle again. It all happened so fast, too fast for his eyes to follow, as Jimmy caught the briefest glimpse of the something in the warehouse as it leaped with incredible speed to the top of one of the box walls, and then leaped again, straight at the tall, thin man, giving a terrifying roar that just seemed to consume the whole world, so loud and so strangely resonant it made Jimmy's body tremble all over, made him fall to his knees, using all his self-restraint just to keep from wetting himself. He could tell from the smell that some others among these stone-cold killers hadn't been able to show similar restraint, though none of them went to their knees, their adult bodies able to withstand more punishment than Jimmy's teenaged body, even if his will was stronger than many of theirs. There was a moment of silence as all eyes, Jimmy's included, went to the top of the truck. There, the tall, thin man was kneeling by his rifle, his mouth open in complete surprise. Standing next to him, only partially visible in the dim lighting of the warehouse interior, was a massive, dark shape out of nightmares, one thick, impossibly muscled arm thrust through the thin man, entering his body beneath one arm, and coming out the other side at the base of his ribs, the arm ending in a powerful hand tipped with razor-sharp, blood-soaked claws. The creature swept the men below with a glance of his white glowing eyes, and then swung his arm around, flinging the thin man from the top of the truck and into their midst with the motion. The tall, thin man's corpse struck several of the guards, the ones with the best weapons, where they'd gathered together in a tight knot. Their firing formation suddenly turned into a disadvantage as they went down in a heap under the body. It was the thick, wet thud of a dead body striking several living ones, coupled with the loud, commanding voice of the boss ordering them to kill the intruder, that seemed to wake them all from their momentary stupor, as guns suddenly lifted and began to fire in flashes, followed by ear-splitting bangs in the dark, enclosed interior of the warehouse. But it was so fast! Jimmy didn't even have time to rise from his knees before the creature landed on its 2 feet right next to him, its great arms swinging over the boy's head, claw tips tearing through flesh and bone with ease, spattering Jimmy's dreadlocks with stray drops of blood, most of the spray flying outward, away from him, splashing onto the tight-pressed mass of gangsters. The lieutenant somehow managed to get a bead on the creature as it brought up its leg, then kicked one of the men packed around it full in the chest, sending him flying out of the pack and right through one of the walls of heavy boxes, which then promptly tumbled down on top of him. Not that it mattered, Jimmy realized, shuddering as his mind registered the crack of every one of the man's ribs breaking at once, his heart and lungs bursting from the force of the impact, killing him instantly. Time had seemed to slow down in that moment for Jimmy, and he started to see every detail, every nuance, his eyes wide as he watched everything happen all at once, the chaos shifting into perfect, crystalline order for him. There was the sound of bullets popping one by one from the lieutenant's machine gun, and Jimmy could swear he saw every one of them as they flew toward the massive thing that had come to kill them all. Just as he could see every one of those bullets, Jimmy could also see how the creature, moving far too fast for something so big, ducked and weaved with astonishing agility, faster and more precise than anything a human could do, the bullets passing by it harmlessly, striking the 2 men behind the creature, sending them tumbling to the floor, their own weapons, intended for close-quarters fighting, clattering to the hard concrete of the warehouse floor. Jimmy's heightened senses didn't end there, not by a long shot. His mind felt as though it were burning up as his head and eyes shifted positions slightly every few moments, keeping the creature in view at all times as it plowed forward, head lowered, sharp horns outthrust to meet and penetrate the chest and stomach of the lieutenant, the one who'd given most of the orders while Jimmy had worked there, his finger twitching in spasms on the machine gun that was now waving around at the end of his now limp arm, forcing the men around him to dive for cover or die where they stood. With a toss of its head, the creature flung the lieutenant up onto the top of a stack of boxes, then turned and almost casually lopped off the head of a man that had come charging at it, screaming loudly with a fire-axe raised high until the creature's backhanded blow had brought the charge to an abrupt end. There were 12 of them left, Jimmy realized with a start as he glanced around at the others, now able to count them as he hadn't before, noting little details about each of the survivors as they fell back into the hallways of boxes, all of them armed with guns now, even if they'd had to take them from some of the fallen. A few of the more ambitious ones tried to snap off a few bursts at the monster, but it had the fire-axe in its hands now, and the bullets sparked as they were deflected from its expertly turning head. The fire-axe seemed almost an extension of the creature's limbs, just another one of its natural weapons as it strode forward with confidence into the rows of high-stacked boxes and crates. Jimmy only caught a few glimpses of the men in those hallways as they ran and ducked and dove and fired their weapons, screaming in fear, anger, or defiance as suited their personalities best, some even trying to shout orders to their fellows, to attempt to coordinate their attacks. He also caught glimpses of the beast as it hunted them down one by one, the narrow confines helping them not a bit as they tried to shoot the monster dead, only to die themselves, their voices each cutting off as suddenly as their lives. Finally, it was all over, and the warehouse was as still as an abattoir after the last pig has stopped squealing. Only the boss and Jimmy were still alive, and Jimmy had the strong impression that wasn't going to stay the case for very long. His hunch was soon played out as the creature stepped calmly from the maze of boxes and began to walk slowly toward the metal stairs leading up to the office. The boss had never panicked, not once, throughout the butchery of his men, and he didn't now. He'd held off firing his pistol because of the lack of a good shot, but now he began to pull the trigger, measuring out each shot, his cold eyes flashing with each bullet that left the chamber as he backed up with the creature's advance, stepping backwards into his office. Jimmy had seen the creature dodge bullets. This time, however, it didn't try to get out of the way, its sleek-furred, muscular body standing erect as it slowly walked up the stairs toward the boss, following him with slow deliberation into the office. Try as he might, Jimmy's mind was reeling now from the strain of the ordeal he'd just been through, and he couldn't force himself to focus his eyes on the creature, not even now, when he had a perfect opportunity to see it clearly for the first time, the light from the office above shining down on its strangely beautiful, statuesque body. Bursts of blood exploded like flowers coming into bloom on the creature's head, its chest, its legs, its arms. Then Jimmy heard the click of the boss's gun, saw the slide on top lock into place as it ran out of deadly projectiles to launch at its foe. Jimmy saw the creature reach out and casually take hold of the boss's throat, lifting him up, ignoring the slow trickle of blood that ran down its body from the many wounds inflicted by the man's weapon. "You have shed the blood of innocence, scion of Cernunnos," said the creature in a voice that, though it was not terribly loud, shook Jimmy to his core. "Just as all these others had, save one. That blood has ceased to cry out for all except you." "You come here," sneered the boss, his own voice barely audible to Jimmy from within the office. "You kill my men, splatter their guts all over my warehouse, and you call us murderers. Don't talk to me about murder, hypocrite. It takes one to know one." "You truly do not know the difference?" asked the creature, its glowing eyes fixing on those of the boss. Though he couldn't explain it, not then and not ever, Jimmy felt them open somehow, and the boss's entire being seemed to open in response, laying bare all that he ever was. "No, you know the difference," said the creature with finality. "You know, and you do your acts of darkness all the same. Then you dare to accuse me of the same darkness that lies in your heart, seeking justification where there can be none." The creature's voice never rose in volume, and yet the intensity of the words grew so strong, Jimmy felt himself pressed down until he was prostrate upon the cold cement of the warehouse floor. He couldn't even imagine what it must be like for the boss, under the full weight of divine judgment, and couldn't even lift his head to see the expression on the man's face. "I am going to kill you now, Antonio Cerza, because if I do not, you will continue to cause the spread of evil to wherever your influence may touch. But your death is going to be messy, because you personally disgust me." I never knew the boss's name. That was the only coherent thought Jimmy could manage as he heard the glass of the office's window shatter, and an instant later heard the man hit the floor at the base of the stairs, flung downward with all the strength contained in the creature's immense, powerful body. The sound. It was unlike anything Jimmy had ever heard before. A wet, viscous explosion coupled with the crackling of every solid part of the dead man's body as they liquefied. The best analogy Jimmy could come up with was that it must be what an especially thick pudding of blood and bone would sound like after being dropped from the top of the towers. If Jimmy hadn't been face down on the floor at that moment, he would surely have been splattered very heavily with the remains of what was once Antonio Cerza. As it was, his clothes were still ruined. The smell would never come out. Daring to look up after some long minutes, Jimmy watched as the creature, a patch of blackness against the stark fluorescent white of the office interior, gripped the sides of the huge safe in the boss's room, pressed down firmly with the sound of screeching metal, and then wrenched the door right off as easily as Jimmy would open a food canister. It rifled inside briefly, and then turned towards the door, a sheaf of papers beneath its arm. Dropping lightly to the floor of the warehouse, the creature walked with the light, ever-ready tread of a honed and lethal jungle predator, making almost no noise despite its huge size, just as its movements had made almost no noise throughout the attack. Turning to the door, the creature lowered its head and plunged forward, plowing into the reinforced metal so fast its outline was blurred. Jimmy covered his ears and closed his eyes against the horrific screeching of the metal exploding outward, and continued to crouch on the floor, resting his weight on his elbows. Everything seemed to rush in upon the boy all at once, and he felt his consciousness wavering. Some minutes passed before Jimmy realized that there were others in the room with him. They were humans, like him. However long he'd been out, they'd gathered up all the fallen weapons of the gang in that span of time, and were just finishing loading them up into the back of the truck, the remaining boxes dumped onto the ground, their white powder contents spilled out over the floor. One of these people walked over to Jimmy, and the kid stared at the man's steel-toed boots for a long while before lifting his head to look up at the man's weather-beaten, swarthy features. "You'd best leave now, child," said the man, not unkindly. "Just a word of wisdom to one who could use it." With that, the swarthy man turned and walked back to the truck, climbing into the driver's side and turning the key. Jimmy could only watch mutely as the truck carefully squeezed out of the sizable hole in the middle of the thick metal door, the sides scraping a little, and then drove off into the dimness of the night's end. Slowly recovering himself, though only a little, Jimmy forced his body to move, to take the man's advice and get himself out of that terrible place of death as soon as he could. He was found, a few hours later, at the place where he'd managed to crawl, and taken into police custody. Now he was sitting in one of the police station's small but private waiting rooms, which also doubled as interrogation rooms, resting his elbows on the card table in front of him, while Sheriff Malone, the chief cop in the town of Riverglen, looked at him from across that table. The sandwich and milk in front of Malone did look awfully good, Jimmy had to admit. "Son," said the cop with a tired smile, I've had a rough couple of nights here. Yesterday I had a late night breaking up a party that nearly turned ugly for some of its fun-seekers. Tonight I'm dealing with the mess at the warehouse. What I'd really like right now is a break. So, son, you mind telling me what happened?" Of course, the sheriff's eyes went down to the sandwich and glass of milk, and then back up to Jimmy's, the offer obvious. More than that, if the sheriff was going to feed him, Jimmy could feel that the man was going to protect him as well. No point in giving somebody what they needed to live, after all, if you were just going to kill them later, not when there were nastier ways to do an interrogation that could get all the details just the same. It wasn't like a black boy had any rights, after all. Then Jimmy's eyes fell, and he found himself staring at his hands. "I'm sorry, sir," he said softly, so softly that Malone had to lean forward to hear. "I can't tell you what happened."